So, in continuing our discussion of vertical systems, first we talked about the autonomic nervous system, then we talked about the somatosensory system and some specific things having to do with pain. And now we're going to move into the motor system. So, in this module, we're going to be talking about chapters 13 and chapter 14. Chapter 13 is sort of the peripheral motor system, and chapter 14 is the central motor system, just like we discussed the somatosensory system in terms of peripheral and central. But all together, it's going to work with the sensory system and the control systems, which we'll discuss in chapter 15 and 16, to produce motor function. So, the learning objectives, and these, some of these cross over into chapter 14, so really these are for chapter 13 and 14, and I'll review them again at the beginning of the chapter 14 lectures. I want you to be able to define those terms: clonus, atrophy, fasciculations, fractionation, hyperreflexia, hypertonia, hypotonia, and spasticity. We'll talk about all of those. What is muscle tone, and how is it assessed in the clinic? Always a good thing to know. Where does the decision about motor activities get made? I want you to be able to define paresis and paralysis, and what is the difference between those two terms. I want you to be able to describe reciprocal inhibition on the neurological level. I want you to be able to describe the difference between slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers and give examples of each of them in the body. You should know why it's important for a sarcomere to be at optimal length. So we'd already talked about this back in kinesiology, way back when, but we didn't necessarily, we did. We talked about actin and myosin, but we're just going to go into a little more depth, but this should not be new information to you. What happens to a muscle if a limb is immobilized with the muscle in a shortened position? And we'll talk about that. And what signs and symptoms would you expect to see if a lower motor neuron was destroyed and the muscle was completely denervated? Spoiler alert, the muscle won't work. Okay, so we're going to just jump in, both feet, motor system. So for any voluntary action that we take, no matter how simple it is, whether it's scratching your nose or picking up a paper clip off the floor, the neural activity begins with a decision made in the anterior part of the frontal lobe, of the brain. Then we have motor planning areas and control circuits in the cerebellum and basal ganglia, which are activated, and the control circuits help control activity in the descending motor tracts. So the motor tracts deliver signals to the brainstem and spinal interneurons and motor neurons, which in the peripheral system we call them lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons transmit signals directly to the skeletal muscles, eliciting contractions of skeletal muscle fibers. So that is the path that's the efferent path from the brain to the muscles. We said, of course, in the somatosensory system that the somatosensation contributes to the decisions that get made. So the voluntary movement is controlled from the top down, brain to spinal cord to muscle, but the decisions that get made depends on the information that you're getting from the periphery, from the lower motor neurons and from the spinal cord and the sensory system. So there's a lot going on in the motor system. Even though it seems like it's going to be pretty simple, it's really not. So we already said this, voluntary movement is controlled from the top down, brain to the spinal cord to the muscle. Okay, so we talked about, I'm sure you talked about in anatomy and physiology, and we talked about in kinesiology, and we're talking about it again, skeletal muscle structure and function. Skeletal muscle is excitable, contractile, extensile, and elastic. All of those characteristics being important to muscle contraction. Individual muscle fibers consist of myofibrils arranged parallel to the long axis of the muscle fiber. So in kinesiology, we talked a lot about line of pull and the directions of the muscle fibers having a lot of play in their function. And so the alignment of the muscle fibers pretty much and where they attach dictates their function. So we have some structural proteins in the muscle fiber. One of them is called titin, and it maintains the position of the myosin relative to the actin and prevents the sarcomere from being pulled apart. So if we didn't have that titin sort of providing structure, the sarcomere wouldn't hold together, basically. So this is our little individual sarcomere, which the top picture, the titin is that orange line that it shows, and it prevents the sarcomere from being pulled apart when the muscle is stretched. And it's maintaining the position of the actin and myosin, because remember, we have to have crossover between actin and myosin in order to get a good muscle contraction. So when the muscle is contracted, that shows at the bottom, the titin is on slack. So the actin and myosin slide over each other. Remember that sliding filament theory. And the titin is not holding the sarcomere together at that point. It's on slack, and it's letting the actin and myosin do their job. So muscle contraction is produced when the actin slides relative to the myosin. So repeated attachment of the myosin, swiveling and detachment of the myosin heads produce the contraction of muscle. None of this information should be news to you because we've talked about this a lot. So the sliding fibers are initiated when calcium binds to troponin, and a conformational change in the troponin induces movement of the tropomyosin to uncover active binding sites on the actin. So this allows the myosin heads to attach to those binding sites. But when the myosin heads swivel, it pulls the actin towards the center of the sarcomere. A repeated attachment, swiveling, and detachment produces contraction of the muscle. So really cool, right? In the module, I have a couple of animated videos, links to animated videos that show the sliding filament theory, and you know, who doesn't love that? So muscles are a little bit like springs in that they have some resistance to stretch depending on their length. A stretched spring generates more resistance to stretch than the same spring when it is shortened, right? So a stretched muscle generates more resistance to stretch than the same muscle when it's shortened. So there are some different things that contribute to total muscle resistance to stretch. Active contraction of the muscle. So if you're contracting a muscle, it's harder to stretch it, right? The titin, that protein that is providing structure to the sarcomere, that has passive resistance to muscle stretch. Weak actin-myosin bondings determine total resistance to muscle stretch as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the weak actin-myosin bondings, but so we have these built-in structural things that are preventing or adding resistance to muscle stretch. Okay, and then we're going to talk about some other things that add resistance to muscle stretch. So muscle tone, in the fitness world, you might say, oh, you have good muscle tone, or you need to improve your muscle tone, or something like that. Okay, that is not what we're talking about. When we're talking about neurological muscle tone, the definition, write this down, you need to know this. It's the resistance to stretch in a resting muscle. Okay, resting muscle, how much does it resist stretch? Clinically, we assess muscle tone with passive range of motion. Passive, not active, passive. So the patient has to be relaxed. The clinician is moving their limb through their range of motion, and the amount of resistance to stretch is what we define as muscle tone. When muscle tone is normal, resistance to passive stretch is minimal. So probably for most of the people in class, most of the people that you've worked with in lab, they have normal muscle tone, and so they have minimal resistance to passive stretch. Normal resting muscle tone is provided by the titin, that structural protein, and those weak actin-myosin bonds. So that normal resting muscle. So I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to run across someone in real life in the clinic who has abnormal muscle tone, but it is quite an eye-opening experience. One of my dear colleagues, who is a fabulous neurological specialist in PT, she's been practicing as a PT for 27 years. This woman knows her stuff. But when she told me when she was in school, she just could not imagine what was meant by muscle tone. You know, you're working on your classmates in lab, you don't know what it feels like for someone that has muscle tone. And when she got into the clinic, it was a real aha moment for her. You're like, oh, that's muscle tone. So it might not make sense to you right now unless you have encountered someone in real life, what it really feels like to have abnormal muscle tone. So when healthy, that being key, innervated muscle is continuously immobilized in a shortened position for prolonged periods, sarcomeres disappear from the end of myofibrils. The loss of sarcomeres is a structural adaptation to the shortened position, so the muscle generates optimal force of the new resting length. Remember in kinesiology when we talked about the optimum muscle contraction, the optimum muscle length, that length-tension relationship, that should all sound pretty familiar. So the muscle will actually adapt to the average muscle length. So if you sit, let's just say in a chair, could be a wheelchair, just could be a chair, with your arms bent 100% of the time, you never straighten them out, you will lose sarcomeres from the ends of your myofibrils. And what we call that is a contracture. So it's a joint contracture. So if a person, say they're in a cast, or a cast boot even, and they're maintaining 90 degrees of elbow flexion for 2 months, or in a cast boot, they're maintaining slightly less than neutral dorsiflexion for 2 months, their muscles will lose sarcomeres. And so the loss of sarcomeres is a structural adaptation to that shortened position. And that's so the muscle can have the proper length-tension relationship to generate optimal force at the new resting length. When a structurally shortened muscle is stretched, it will quickly reach the limits of its elasticity and therefore will be very resistant to stretch. So the decreased amount of titin available to be stretched will limit the extensibility of the muscle and the decreased number of sarcomeres in that myofibril. On the other side of the coin, if a muscle is immobilized in a lengthened position, the muscle will add new sarcomeres. So chronic loading of muscles, such as with physical training, regular stretching, using dynamic splinting, that sort of thing, can stimulate mechanoreceptors that switch on the genes for producing collagen and extracellular matrix to improve the muscle's tensile strength. So our muscles are going to adapt whether they're adapting to a shorter position or a longer position. If they're adapting to a shorter position, you're going to lose sarcomeres. If they're adapting to a longer position, you're going to gain sarcomeres. Hopefully that makes sense. So the thing that this was like a big aha moment for me when I was in PTA school and I took neuro, because I always wondered why. I've always been sort of a not very flexible person, but over 25, 30 years of doing yoga, I eventually got to where I could touch my toes and that kind of thing. It took me a long time though, and I thought, why? Why did that happen? And why did it take so long? And I think this adaptation of muscle length was a big part of it. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. When you find an example that you can really relate to on a personal level, it can be an aha moment right there. So both elastic and contractile forces of muscles that act on a joint determine the joint's resistance to movement. So the joint's resistance to movement can be increased by co-contraction. And we talked a little bit about co-contraction in kinesiology, and it's the simultaneously contraction of antagonist muscles. So that's the one where you're standing on the bus because there are no seats, and you have to contract your hamstrings and your quadriceps and probably a lot of other things to keep from falling over, to stabilize your joints. So co-contraction stabilizes joints. Contracting the agonist and the antagonist together stabilizes the joint. In the upper limbs, we use this co-contraction to enable precise movements. So contracting agonist around the wrist enables the precise finger movements needed for fine work, like threading a needle or doing some really tiny skill, some tiny fine motor skill. In the lower limbs, co-contractions allows a person to stand on an unstable surface, like a moving bus or the deck of a ship. So people frequently use co-contraction when learning a new movement skill. And I sort of think of this when I was teaching knitting. Newer knitters have a lot of times knit really tight because they're contracting all the muscles in their hands, wrists, and arms to make that precise movement. And hopefully as they master the skill, they can relax their hands. It can be a much more relaxing activity. So co-contraction gives you that control when you're learning a new movement. Pretty cool, right?